Hi friends, and welcome to The Objective Hindu. Today I want to talk to you about the Waqf Act and the proposed changes to the Waqf Act, which are at the moment in the Indian Parliament, in fact being reviewed by a joint parliamentary committee. It's quite a complex, historical, legally heavy act, and there's a lot of legacy that it has that needs to be understood if you want to really understand what's going on and why it's such an important legislation that this current government has bought. But what I'll try and do is that in the next 20 minutes or so, give you a historical context, explain why we are where we are, and why we need to actually fix many things that are broken about the current Waqf legislation that this particular amendment seeks to remedy. Now, obviously, there are lots of people protesting. Your AIMIMM, All India Personal Law Board, Jamiyat-e-Ulema-e-Hind, the usual suspects. But I don't give too much credibility to that because I think that their narrative is devoid of any substance, and their whole idea is that if any sort of changes or any sort of tinkering to anything that's got Islam or Muslims related, even remotely associated with it, it's a bad idea. So whatever you do, they're going to scream. They oppose the triple talaq, they oppose the Citizenship Amendment Bill, and of course, no doubt, they're going to oppose the Waqf Amendment Bill as well. But hyperbole aside, let's try and understand firstly what is a Waqf. So a Waqf in not necessarily in Islam, but I would say in an Islamic context, is an endowment. It's a religious endowment, which essentially is based on the idea that you, as the owner of a property, usually land, give that property or that asset in perpetuity for some sort of a charitable cause, usually a religious or a quasi-religious / charitable cause. So you become the Waqif, and the property that's been given into Waqf is then for perpetuity remains as a Waqf property. You can say that property has been endowed in the service of God or in the service of Allah. Some people might even say that the property belongs to Allah for all times to come. So there's nothing wrong with the idea. In fact, it's probably worth spending a second on why do you even need a Waqf? So there are many reasons, but one of the very interesting reasons why I think you actually have a concept of Waqf is actually to safeguard against future appropriation of property by your descendants and your future generations. So let's say you have a piece of land, and let's say you want to, build a hospital on it, or a mosque on it, or whatever, right? It's your land, you can do whatever you want with it. I'm talking about in the modern context. Let's say you want to do that. Now, let's say you build a hospital on it, and there's an endowment that you make, and you raise the money and you build a hospital. So let's say you have a piece of land, and in the modern context, let's say, and you want to build, let's say, a hospital on it, some sort of a charitable hospital, or a mosque, let's say, to make it even more realistic. You can build that because it's your land, but what you can't do is you cannot ensure what will happen to that land and to that structure or whatever you've built on it, and whatever the purpose it seeks to serve after you're dead. Because, of course, then it will pass on to your descendants, who might or might not agree with your ideas of what's the best use for that particular property, and might divide that amongst themselves, might change the property's usage, might sell it off, or whatever the case might be. But if you give that property into Waqf, your future generations can no longer change or alter that status quo. Like I said, it's an endowment for perpetuity, in perpetuity. So that's a very important reason why this concept actually exists. And in principle, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, right? You decided that this is always to be used for purposes A, B, and C. Now, the common purposes historically for which a Waqf was created, by the way, a Waqf is created, and the deed via which it's created is called the Waqf deed in English, or the Waqfnama in Farsi and Urdu. So when a property is given into Waqf, The usual examples historically were essentially people who own land, kings or semi-sovereign sort of rulers, zamindars, etc., giving away pieces of their property because they virtually owned everything. There was no concept of property rights as we know today, as we know of it today. So they could, let's say, give 10 acres of land to this mosque, or 10 acres of land for a community graveyard, or something that they feel is going to serve the common good. Usually it had a slightly religious context to it, but it didn't necessarily need to. There are examples of waqf being made for caravansarais, which you can think of as travelers' inns. So these were also created by virtue of someone giving properties into a waqf in north and northwestern India. So these are legitimate examples, I would say, of a waqf, and historically they've been given by people who obviously own property. And again, if you deduct the last 100 years and if you ignore that, this almost always meant that all sorts of waqfs were created only by the ruling class, because there was no concept of modern property right as we know it today. Now, some people say that why don't we just abolish the Waqf Act? And that is a very misleading sort of expectation. And the reason for that is that we have a lot of property that is under Waqf administration in India. In fact, it's the largest Waqf holding anywhere in the world. It's, I think, 9.4 lakh acres of land is under Waqf management across the various boards, which I'll explain to you in a second. And this makes the Waqf properties then the third largest landholder, or the Waqf boards are the third largest landholders in India after the Defense Services and Indian Railways. So it's a non-trivial amount, and not all of this is actually very legitimate. But anyway, the fact is that there is more than 9 lakh acres today registered with the various Waqf boards across the states of India. And we need a governing framework to decide what happens with that property, who runs it, what happens to its money, how is it administered, etc. And that was actually the genesis of the first legislative attempt to regulate Waqf properties, which was actually made by the British in 1913. Some might say 1923. Actually, it goes back to 1913, when there was actually an act, it was called the Musalman Waqf Act, which essentially didn't do anything. It just allowed for the recognition of Waqf as a valid it gave it legal status. Then in 1923, that act was given some, a more sort of sophisticated framework in terms of who can do what, how do you prove that you own the property, who's going to run it, what happens to the money, what's the role of the sort of civic or judicial authorities in that particular region, etc. So all that started taking shape in 1923s. In 1923. Now, it's worth quickly pointing out that this was extracted from the British by the Muslim community in India. And in some ways, the British didn't really want much to do with this. So it was an act that conceded pretty much everything that the Muslims asked of the British. Because again, traditionally, for good reason, I would say, because traditionally, all of this really related to mosques and graveyards and community sites, etc. And the British didn't really have any interest or a say in any of those anyway. And so in their mind, they were just creating a framework that legislates and recognizes something that was already, at least from on the ground, already a reality. But why this is an important point to bear in mind is that the British did not necessarily need to think about the future, about what the Hindus might have to say, what happens after they leave the country, etc. And of course, modern property rights had only just started to arise in India, and most land holdings were not with the ordinary citizens back in 1923. So this act therefore was highly deficient when it's looked upon from a modern context today. But anyways, that's how it started. And that allowed institutions to be created, and that allowed people, again, usually people who own something worth giving, which was a very small minority, to create waqfs and create waqf deeds, and this was then recognized under law. Now, what has since happened, though, over the last almost 100 years, right? 101 years since that act. Firstly, that act has gone through many, many incarnations. Independent India created its first Waqf Act in 1954, and then it was amended in 65, and I think again in 80s, and then 1995, it was given a huge shot in the arm by the Congress government, which gave it excessive powers, which some of which are now being reined in by this particular amendment that's been tabled in the Parliament. But what has happened, interestingly, over the years is that it's turned into some sort of a land-grabbing, usurping sort of scheme. Because originally the idea was that this really only applies to the, in quotes, obvious Muslim sites or sites that are clearly intricately linked with the Muslim community and their religion and whatever purposes that they seek to serve through those sites. And what I mean by that is usually there is mosques and graveyards and that sort of stuff. But what has happened in the last several years, in the last 100, but particularly I'd say since the 1995 amendments, which gave the Waqf boards a lot of power, is that all sorts of properties started being notified, which they can do so arbitrarily, I'll explain this in a second, as Waqf properties. And this led to almost a one-way sort of traffic into a lot of properties without due process of law, without proper consultation, without giving someone else an opportunity to object to it, turning into Waqf properties. And the law then makes it really hard for someone to challenge a property that's been declared as a Waqf property. I'll explain this when I go through the some of these extraordinary powers that are granted to the Waqf board under the current legislation in a second. But this is why we have so much Waqf land. So it will be very, it's an assertion I'm making, but it's a very sort of logical assertion to make that most Waqf land that is registered with the Waqf boards in India, there are many boards, every state has a Waqf board, by the way. Most of this land has been, there was never a proper deed or a Waqf nama because they've just, ended up being used by a particular community. And at some stage, the Waqf board, especially post 1995, claimed it as theirs. And because that land might have not been owned by an individual, no one really contested it. I'll give you some examples in a second too of some of these instances. So that's how we have a lot of land today under Waqf management. Now, I briefly touched upon the Waqf board. So previously, before the 1995 amendments, there were state-level Waqf boards. And actually, the 1995 amendment brought, I can't recollect this, it was either that one or the one after that. But there are state-level Waqf boards, and these boards are meant to survey and maintain a register of all Waqf properties. There's also a Waqf tribunal, and that tribunal is essentially a dispute resolution court that operates in parallel with your civic courts for all matters related to Waqfs. And this is, again, these are the things that have led to a lot of conflict and a lot of cases, etc., with unhappy people going to the tribunal. But the tribunal and the composition of the tribunal and the Waqf boards is heavily in favor of the Muslim people. So it's almost a case of the criminal of the aggrieved going to the criminals and asking for justice in some of these cases at least. So and that needs to be undone. All right. Before we move on to looking at some of the anomalies in the law. And why, therefore, the amendments are absolutely necessary. In fact, I'd argue they don't even go far enough. But before we do that, I want to give you 4 or 5 really amazing examples of what the existing legislation allows the Waqf board to do. So I think in 2005, the Taj Mahal was declared as a Waqf property. Now, who declares this? This was the UP Waqf board. UP has 2 Waqf boards for the Shias and the Sunnis, so this was the UP Sunni Waqf board. So they just declared Taj Mahal as a Waqf property. They have the power to do that. Now, the thing is that, of course, no one is contesting that because you and I don't claim to own the Taj Mahal anyway. So it's what would be called in economics as a public good. So that was notified. And the Archaeological Survey of India, which is the government body in charge of sort of, looking after the Taj Mahal and other such bodies, has now challenged that. Because what happens is that once that's been notified, the Waqf board and the Waqf tribunal can instruct any encroachment, including government bodies such as the ASI, to vacate that land in 6 months. So not only was the Taj Mahal declared as a Waqf property, the Taj Mahal, the Waqf board also asked the ASI to vacate the Taj Mahal. So it was just hilarious. But this was actually legally permissible if you want to look at it. Now, this is still in court. So ASI went to the High Court and challenged this. And from 2005, the case is still pending. The High Court has, by the way, asked the Sunni Waqf Board of Uttar Pradesh to produce the Waqf Nama or the deed, basically saying, please show us where Shah Jahan put this property into a Waqf for perpetuity, which obviously they have no such evidence. So how do they claim that? And this is, will be clear in another couple of examples. Actually, let me give you a couple of examples first. Then there's the Bangalore Eidgah case, where there's essentially a large playground. It's like a public playground, and there's a mosque adjoining it. And, for centuries, there's a mosque, and, people pray there, and, children play there, and others use that land for whatever they need to. It's just, public land. And apparently now that's been declared as Waqf property. So when some Hindus in the region wanted to have a Ganesh festival on that land, they realized that they needed permission from the Waqf board, which was, of course, duly rejected. And so they have now challenged this idea as to when and how did this public land become Waqf land. Again, this is a case of the Waqf board merely notifying this as Waqf property. And because, again, no individual owned that playground, there was no one else who was contesting it either. And so the issue only came to light by chance because someone tried to approach the civic administration for permission to hold a festival there, and the civic administration then followed the law and asked that person to seek permission from the Waqf board, thereby revealing the fact that that property is actually Waqf property. No one even knew about it because it was just all done via just the notification in the official gazette, which no one reads. Another very curious example is an entire village in Tamil Nadu where a person was trying to sell off his land. And so he was trying to sell off his land. And when he went to the district authorities to register the sale, they said that you need permission from the Waqf board because this entire village is a Waqf property. Now, this is how ridiculous things have become. No one owns a village, so there's no question of the village becoming a Waqf property. Not to mention that the village is a Hindu village. It's even got a 1,500-year-old temple in that village, which, by the way, by law now is a Waqf property. So the temple is a Waqf property. So again, that's now in the Supreme Court, and that's also raised a lot of eyebrows, and it's a great example of how the act has reached a stage, how these powers that the Waqf boards have reached a stage that they can almost literally do anything. The examples go on and on. Someone submitted a Waqf, someone said that they're donating 2 of the islands in Dwarka, in Bet Dwarka, which is, where Lord Krishna was. He was not born there, but it's considered to be his sort of kingdom, fiefdom. 2 of the islands there to be Waqf lands, and so that was thrashed by the courts. But again, all of this was notified before someone went and fought. And so examples are galore of how this happens. There's another one which is my favorite. The office of the Surat Municipal Corporation. This is amazing. So this is the Surat Municipal Corporation, right? The Gujarat Waqf Board has notified the Surat Municipal Corporation building to be a Waqf property, and has asked the Surat Municipal Corporation to vacate it because they're encroachers. And so now the Surat Municipal Corporation is fighting in the Gujarat High Court against the Gujarat Waqf Board, asking for some sort of reprieve because this is just ridiculous. How the hell did you own that building? Now, one of the reasons this has ended up the way it's ended up was that there was a concept of Waqf by user. So originally, remember, you could only give something into Waqf if you owned it. So you created a Waqf Nama, the deed, and you said, this is my land, and I am now hereby giving it into Waqf. And then the Waqf administration mechanism, the board, and the person who administers it, he's called a Mutawali. They come into the picture, and then they'll essentially forever do what you've asked them to do, right? So that's the perpetual sort of element. But now with, the Taj Mahal, there was no Waqfnama. The Gujarat Municipal Corporation building, there's no Waqfnama. So how the hell did the Waqf boards then notify those as Waqf properties in the first place? So the secret is that there's this concept of Waqf by user, and what's really happened is it's a legal innovation where the Waqf boards have argued that if something has been in use for a long time by the Muslim community, it becomes Waqf property. Same thing happened in the Bangalore Eidgah as well. Same thing is being argued by the opposing side in the Gyanvapi Mosque and the Krishna Janmabhoomi mosque case, where the Hindu side is fighting these battles in the Allahabad High Court. In fact, this tells you a little bit about the existing legal mechanisms and how favorable they are for the Muslims, that the defense counsels for both the Gyanvapi Mosque and the Krishna Janmabhoomi Devasthan have asked what their appeal is. They have asked the Allahabad High Court to reject this petition and send it to the Waqf board. So pretty convenient, right? So they're not saying that this person's wrong. They're just saying that, Mr. High Court, you should not get involved in this. This is a dispute that needs to be settled in the Waqf tribunal, not the Waqf board. And of course, the Waqf tribunals are, they are basically Islamic bodies. They're like these quasi-Sharia courts. So imagine trying to go to the Waqf tribunal and explain to them that, this was never given in Waqf and therefore you should relinquish control. That's not happening. So this is this idea of Waqf by user, where over an extended period of time, even if there's no deed or property transaction, which obviously there wasn't because there were no property rights, the Waqf board has the power to claim properties as Waqf properties. Again, in principle, right, if this is applied very fairly, it's not a problem, because what this really means, think about it very deeply. What this means is, let's say there's a graveyard somewhere. There's a Muslim graveyard, Qabristan. Now, there's no Waqfnama for a graveyard. I mean, no one planned a graveyard. It's just, over centuries, people started, deciding where to bury their dead ones, and that turned into a graveyard. And now someone needs to administer it. The graveyard, needs some money for maintenance, etc. So this is a legitimate example of what I would say is Waqf by user, because there is no Waqfnama for this, and there can't be. So either the government has to say that we will manage it, right? In that case, the government then needs to take civic control. And so then that's a totally different direction. Then they need to do it for mosques and other stuff as well. Either they need to do that, or they basically are okay with the Waqf management, the Waqf board of that state, to say that this is Waqf land, which basically means that this will remain a graveyard for the Muslims in perpetuity, and that they will manage it, including, how it's funded and how it's run, etc. So this was, I think, this is an example of what I would say is a legitimate sort of usage of this clause. But then when they wake up one morning and say that the Taj Mahal is a Waqf property, or the Surat Municipal Corporation's office is a Waqf property, then that is clearly it's insidious and it's mischievous, because now you're just trying to usurp land that doesn't belong to you, and because it's very hard to take it back from the Waqf board because it's for perpetuity, then it just seems like a scheme to expand your sort of your control over large tracts of land in India. All right, so lots of information in there, perhaps a little bit more than I thought. So what I'll do is I'll stop here and summarize this for you, and then I'll create another video where we'll talk about all the problems with the existing law. So I've got 7 or 8 specific points, and the sort of extra judicial powers and extra, I would say even extra constitutional powers that the Waqf boards and the Waqf tribunals have in a subsequent video. And then I'll also maybe talk about some of the amendments and some of the changes that the new legislation has proposed. So in conclusion, again, just taking a step back, there's this idea of a religious endowment. There's nothing wrong with it. It needs to be regulated because there's a lot of land already that's Waqf land, so we just can't do away with it. The idea was for Muslims to figure out their communal spaces, and that was fine. but now that's extended into all sorts of ridiculous scenarios where clearly there's a case of overreach on the part of these Waqf bodies and institutions, and the 1995 Act gives them fairly unconstrained power to do things when it comes to Waqf properties, including registering new Waqfs and declaring certain properties to be part of their Waqfs. So that's the main problem, and it is a crisis. It's a big issue. Actually, I forgot to mention something very interesting. There are more than 40,000 appeals pending I think it's in the Waqf tribunals together, right? At the moment. So there's lots of, judicial backlog as well, so to say. But only 992 of these are filed by Muslims. So think about this for a second. More than 40,000 or whatever, more than 39,000 of them are filed by Hindus. And that's a big issue, because then a Hindu is having to go to some kind of a quasi-Sharia tribunal to ask for his or her rights, whereas they should really be able to just go to the local court as part of our standard legal secular framework and get their pleas heard and get whatever respite they're seeking. So you can see that it's disproportionately affecting people of one community, as reflected in the breakdown of the appeals and the cases that are pending across all the boards that I have explained earlier. So anyway, that's the big picture. Hopefully this was helpful for you to understand. And then in the next video, we'll talk about the existing law, why it's so bad, and what needs to change. Thank you.